A new wave of devastating Russian airstrikes against Ukraine has once again pushed the war into one of its most dangerous phases in recent months. Overnight attacks involving ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and dozens of drones targeted several major Ukrainian cities, leaving widespread destruction, civilian casualties, and growing international concern about the possibility of further escalation. Explosions echoed across multiple regions as air raid sirens sounded for hours. Ukrainian officials described the bombardment as one of the largest coordinated attacks carried out by Russia this year. Residential buildings, energy infrastructure, warehouses, and transportation hubs were reportedly hit during the strikes. The attacks immediately dominated global headlines, while world leaders condemned the escalation and called for emergency international consultations. Kyiv, under heavy fire, the capital city, Kyiv, experienced one of the most intense nights since the beginning of the conflict. Residents reported hearing continuous explosions as Ukrainian air defense systems attempted to intercept incoming missiles and drones over the city. Videos circulating on social media showed massive fireballs lighting up the night sky, while anti-aircraft systems fired repeatedly from different districts of the capital. Thick smoke rose over several neighborhoods by early morning. According to Ukrainian authorities, debris from intercepted missiles fell onto apartment buildings, causing fires and damaging civilian infrastructure. Emergency crews spent hours rescuing trapped residents from partially collapsed structures. Witnesses described scenes of panic as families rushed into underground metro stations and bomb shelters during the bombardment. "We heard several loud explosions almost at once," one Kyiv resident told local media. "Windows shook, car alarms started going off everywhere, and people were running into the streets." Power outages were also reported in several districts after energy facilities were damaged during the attack. Southern and eastern regions hit simultaneously. The strikes were not limited to the capital. Ukrainian officials confirmed that multiple regions across the south and east of the country were targeted at the same time. In Kharkiv, several industrial facilities and residential areas were reportedly damaged. Local authorities said emergency responders battled large fires throughout the night. Meanwhile, in Odessa, missile fragments allegedly struck port infrastructure near the Black Sea coast. Witnesses reported hearing repeated detonations near warehouse complexes and logistics facilities. In the central city of Dnipro, officials confirmed damage to transportation infrastructure and residential neighborhoods. Emergency workers were seen clearing rubble, while medics treated injured civilians nearby. The simultaneous nature of the attacks suggested a carefully coordinated military operation designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses across multiple regions at once. Russia claims military targets were hit. Russian officials stated that the strikes were aimed at military and strategic infrastructure connected to Ukraine's defense capabilities. Moscow claimed the attacks targeted ammunition depots, drone production facilities, and military command centers. Russian state media described the operation as retaliation for recent Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian territory and infrastructure. However, Ukrainian officials strongly rejected Moscow's explanation, accusing Russia of deliberately targeting civilian areas and terrorizing the population. Through large-scale missile bombardments, President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned the strikes in a televised address, describing them as another night of terror against peaceful cities. "The world must understand that these attacks are directed not only against Ukraine, but against the stability of Europe itself," Zelensky said. Air defense systems face enormous pressure. Military analysts noted that the latest attacks once again highlighted the enormous strain placed on Ukraine's air defense systems. Since the beginning of the conflict, Western allies have supplied Ukraine with advanced defense systems, including Patriot missile batteries and other anti-aircraft equipment. However, experts warn that Russia's growing use of mass drone and missile attacks is creating serious challenges for Ukrainian defenses. By launching large numbers of drones alongside ballistic and cruise missiles, Russian forces attempt to exhaust Ukrainian interception capabilities and force defenders to spread resources across multiple cities simultaneously. Several analysts believe Moscow is increasingly relying on saturation tactics, designed to overwhelm defensive systems rather than penetrate them individually. The strategy appears aimed at creating constant psychological pressure, while testing the limits of Ukrainian air defenses, one European security expert said. Ukrainian military officials claimed that many incoming targets were intercepted successfully, but acknowledged that some missiles managed to break through defensive lines and hit critical infrastructure. Civilians once again bear the brunt as in previous waves of attacks. Civilians suffered heavily from the bombardment. Hospitals in several regions reportedly received dozens of injured residents overnight. Emergency responders continued searching damaged buildings throughout the morning, fearing that additional victims might still be trapped under rubble. Humanitarian organizations warned that repeated strikes on infrastructure could worsen living conditions for millions of Ukrainians already struggling with power shortages, economic instability, and ongoing displacement. Children and elderly residents were among those evacuated from heavily damaged neighborhoods. Photos from affected areas showed shattered apartment blocks, burned vehicles, broken glass covering streets, and firefighters battling massive blazes in residential districts. Psychologists working with displaced families warned that the repeated attacks are leaving deep emotional scars on civilians, especially children who have spent years living under constant air raid alerts. Global leaders react with concern. The latest strikes triggered immediate reactions from governments around the world. Leaders from European countries condemned the attacks and reiterated support for Ukraine. Several NATO officials warned that continued escalation could further destabilize regional security. The United States also criticized the strikes, with officials describing the bombardment as evidence that the conflict remains highly dangerous and unpredictable. Emergency meetings were reportedly discussed among Western diplomats regarding additional military aid packages for Ukraine, including more air defense systems and ammunition. At the same time, international organizations renewed calls for efforts aimed at preventing further escalation. The United Nations expressed concern about civilian casualties and urged all sides to respect international humanitarian law. Fear of a larger escalation growing. Security analysts believe the latest attacks may signal a broader escalation phase in the conflict. Over recent months, both Russia and Ukraine have increased long-range drone and missile operations, expanding the geographical scope of the war far beyond frontline positions. Some experts warn that the continued cycle of retaliatory strikes could eventually trigger even more dangerous confrontations involving critical infrastructure or neighboring regions. Energy infrastructure remains a particularly sensitive target. Previous attacks on power facilities caused widespread blackouts across Ukraine during winter months, raising fears that similar tactics may intensify again. Economic analysts also warned that prolonged instability could affect global energy markets, shipping routes, and grain exports from the Black Sea region. Social media flooded with images of destruction as the attacks unfolded overnight. Social media platforms were flooded with dramatic footage from across Ukraine. Videos showed anti-aircraft tracers streaking across the sky, explosions lighting up residential districts, and emergency workers carrying injured civilians away from damaged buildings. Hashtags related to the strikes quickly began trending worldwide as users shared images, eyewitness accounts, and political reactions. Some footage appeared to show apartment buildings engulfed in flames, while residents watched from nearby streets in shock. Journalists covering the attacks described the atmosphere in several cities as chaotic and emotionally overwhelming. There were explosions every few minutes, one reporter said during a live broadcast from Kyiv. People were exhausted, frightened, and uncertain about what would happen next. Russian and Ukrainian narratives continue to clash as with previous major attacks. Moscow and Kyiv presented sharply different versions of events. Russian officials argued that the operation targeted military infrastructure and accused Ukraine of using civilian areas to store equipment and weapons. Ukrainian authorities insisted that residential districts were intentionally targeted and accused Russia of attempting to intimidate the population through terror tactics. International observers noted that verifying battlefield claims independently remains extremely difficult due to the intensity of the conflict and restrictions in combat zones. Nevertheless, images from multiple cities appeared to confirm significant damage to civilian infrastructure. Europe watches the situation nervously. The renewed escalation has intensified fears across Europe that the war could become even more unpredictable. Several European governments have increased monitoring of regional security risks, while military officials continue assessing the broader implications of the latest attacks. Concerns are especially strong in Eastern European countries located near the conflict zone. Diplomats privately acknowledged that the possibility of accidental escalation involving NATO territory remains one of the greatest fears surrounding the war. At the same time, political divisions within Europe over military spending and long-term support for Ukraine continue to grow. Some governments advocate increasing military aid immediately, while others worry about the economic and political consequences of prolonged confrontation with Russia. Humanitarian crisis deepens. Humanitarian organizations warn that repeated large-scale bombardments are worsening the already severe humanitarian situation inside Ukraine. Millions of civilians remain displaced, while many cities continue struggling with damaged infrastructure and economic disruption. Aid workers say repeated air raid alerts have created an atmosphere of permanent psychological exhaustion for much of the population. Schools, hospitals, and transportation systems continue operating under constant threat of attack. International charities have called for additional emergency funding to support civilians affected by the latest wave of destruction. What happens next? Military analysts believe the coming weeks could become critical in determining whether the conflict enters an even more dangerous phase. Some experts expect further Russian missile and drone attacks in response to Ukrainian operations inside Russian territory. Others fear that both sides may continue escalating long-range strikes against infrastructure targets. Diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the war remain stalled, while neither Moscow nor Kyiv appears ready to back down. For ordinary civilians living under constant air raid sirens, however, the geopolitical debates matter far less than the immediate reality of survival. As dawn broke over damaged Ukrainian cities once again, firefighters continued searching through rubble. Families gathered belongings from shattered apartments, and exhausted residents prepared for another uncertain night in a war that shows no clear sign of ending anytime soon.